tell me, because I'm not used to doing this. I mean, I know it's Sunday, but I'm no Oprah, and this is not Super Soul Sunday, so that's why I have a lot of papers. And so this is Fiona Robertson. I know her as a facilitator and a teacher of the Embodied Inquiries. I'm not completely objective, because Fiona has facilitated me and Simon and Anna many times, and has really guided us to really see our deeply held beliefs on a whole nother level, and has really guided us to feeling our emotions, the ones we really try to run away from and we couldn't hold them by ourselves. She was really there to facilitate us with loving kindness through all of this. So I'll always be very grateful for that. This is her second book. The first book is The Art of Finding Yourself, Live Bravely and Awaken to Your True Nature. And now we're going to talk about this book, The Dark Night of the Soul, A Journey from Absence to Presence. So, welcome.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you so much for all of you for being here. We meant to say, if you can hear at the back or you can't hear, just let us know and we'll speak more loudly.
Yeah. And there's a camera here, because this is being taped. I just wanted to do it. I know I look very formal, but we don't want to make this too formal, because the whole thought is we were so happy that she came here to share her experience of the book with us, and it's a very informal book, very close to your heart. So even though I'm doing the interview right now, if we talk about a subject that really, resonates somewhere, and you really feel that the question is coming up, please just ask the question, and then we'll see just how the interview flows from there. So I told you about the camera. You have the possibility to ask questions, and probably also personal stuff can come up. We're the only ones that get filmed. We can shut the camera, but you can also trust us. If the things you say you don't want them to be filmed, then we'll just cut them out before we place them on the internet. Just I hope you have the trust that we'll be very respectful with your information. So let's talk about the book. That's why did a lot of people read the book? Some people got it in front. Is there anybody who read the book? Yeah, there's some people. So that's a good thing that we'll start again with the book. I'll just get my professional papers underneath. I really like the fact that when you start the book, the first thing you say is, I've written this book for all those who are in the dark night of the soul, for those who've gone through it, and for those who are curious about it. So what does the dark night of the soul mean to you?
Yeah, to me it means a phase in our lives that we go through where everything we thought we've known starts to fall apart, including ourselves. And the personality that we formed, I use a variety of words for it in the book, a persona or mask or character or adapted self, starts to fall apart. And it can be, different people have a very different version of it, but there are similar things within it. So we were talking earlier in saying some people it's very dramatic, it's a big crash in life. Other people it's much more gentle in a way, much more subtle. But whether it's sort of big or small, it's still a falling apart of that structure of who we thought we were.
And can you tell me more about your own experience in that? Like, what was before and what did fall for you?
Yeah. So interestingly, just before it started, I felt like my life had really come together for the first time ever. So I was feeling quite pleased with myself. I can remember thinking a couple of weeks before it started, I finally become the person I wanted to be. And I think I'd been aspiring, like all of us do, to some sort of ideal notion of who I thought I should be. And I was doing quite well at achieving that. I was running a health clinic, and I'd done up my house, and I had a new relationship with a very professional man who was seemed to be completely different to my usual type of boyfriend. And in retrospect, I can see that the dark night was coming, but at the time, it just felt like a crash. And one day I went into work, and the clinic was probably closing because the funding had stopped. And so there were stresses and difficulties. But I just walked into work one day and I had to just leave. There was so much emotion, anxiety, and I just went home saying, I can't keep it together anymore. I can't hold this together. So that was the beginning of it.
Because I saw in that first part about the dark night of the soul, you say it was calling because you lost contact with yourself in the most fundamental way. I thought that was a really special. What is that, losing contact with yourself?
I think it's quite a subtle thing, because on one level, like I say, I wasn't walking around up until that point thinking that there was anything wrong. But I think my whole focus was on the externals. It was on work, it was on how I looked. And looking back, I was quite vain. You know, I was constantly judging my body and so on. It was really on the externals and achieving that ideal and what people thought of me and all of that. So there was a degree to which I'd lost contact with my real sense of who I am. And I think that happened a long, long time prior to that. I mean, we'll probably talk about that more, about how that really started in childhood. But it felt like I wasn't really being myself in some way. So one of the first realizations I had was that, wow, I've really lost contact with my soul, or that sense of my deeper self.
Because then, you already began about it, but the first chapter is also called The Crash. And you say at a certain point, because now you say also you had it all together. You thought at that moment you had it, all the things you were working hard for, you had them together, and you say, like, I tried so long, if it didn't do it, I'll make it or say it. If I didn't do it or make it or say it, it wouldn't be done. So I feel there was a lot of doing in your life.
There was a huge amount of doing, a huge amount of controlling, of managing, and a sense that, I had to do all of that the whole thing was about doing. I couldn't relax. There was really no trust, actually. So there was a real sense of, I have to make this happen. And there's a huge energy that goes into that, the energy of that trying and forcing and holding it all up ultimately was exhausting.
And is that what the crash was? You couldn't hold it up anymore? Or?
Yeah, I think fundamentally it was the weight. It was the weight of what I was holding up, and it was also the pressure of what I was holding in, because in order to keep it together, I had to keep down so many feelings, so many issues that hadn't really been explored up until then.
Yeah.
So it was the falling apart, it was the crashing rather of my ability to both hold it up and keep it all down.
Yeah. So holding the picture up to the world and holding all of those feelings down.
Yeah.
You say something else that struck me in that chapter, more than one stuff I'll talk about, is that you also named there maybe more of the people who are here or have experienced that, the spiritual path. So you don't only describe the way you were working and more money, the perfect boyfriend, but also that there was a lot of seeking or images in your spiritual path.
Yeah.
Something you were looking for.
It definitely. I mean, I think at that point I'd been in some way spiritually seeking for about 15, 20 years. And a lot of the way that I did it was through complementary medicine. So I was trying to find the perfect remedy or the perfect therapy, the perfect solution, which would make me not this. So there was a sense of there's always something wrong here, there's something that needs to be fixed. And I'd also come across the idea of enlightenment some years previously. So there was this idea that at some point the ideal was to reach enlightenment.
Yeah. You were at the enlightenment, the thing we're all looking for. I am. I still
Yeah.
hope one day I'll wake up and...
And there's a line in the book that I use later on in the book where I say something like, enlightenment, the fantasy tailor-made for perfectionists with low self-esteem. And I think that was really what was coming in, this fantasy of like, oh, if only I get there, then I'll be perfect, then I won't be this, you know, person with all this wrongness.
Yeah. I remember my own part in that because I didn't have a dramatic crash. I just did have like a self-belief that I wasn't aware of, and that was triggered, and it was so painful. And I just couldn't get out. I could only do the thing that I'm very good at, and that is being very analytical, which made me re-traumatize myself day in, day out, because there was no intellectual solution. And I already read Eckhart and everything, and I thought, that what he says is right, like the mind and the monkey mind, but how do I do that?
Yeah.
Like, can somebody tell me how that works? Because I know it rationally, but it's not working. So that's a bit what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And then you say, which I really love, and I'll just get the page of it. You were talking about the two parts, you know, the image around you that you were trying to perfection, and the thing inside of you that you were trying to hold. And you say, however hard I tried, I could not control or manage the deluge of emotions, sensations, memories, and thoughts that poured forth once the dam burst. This was an affront to my ego. I prided myself on self-control and self-containment.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, what you were saying about needing to, our first thing, and I think it's partly a cultural thing, isn't it, that we're taught to think. Yeah. So in schools and our education, we're taught to think, but we're not taught how to feel. So our natural thing is to try and think our way through things, isn't it? And in the dark night, there was no possibility of doing that. I mean, it's so physical and visceral. So there's no thought. I mean, thinking obviously is a very useful thing to be able to do, but in that instance, it really doesn't help. And so my persona, I did think I was clever, and so if you're clever, you know, you can manage things and you can think your way through things. No.
And then the crash, you know, the intensity of it, for me, if I read it, it's, I mean, in a way we're all afraid, like, to break, because you're just scared you're going to end up in a psych ward and somebody...
Yeah.
How was that for you?
Yeah.
Like, if you do realize that all the containment isn't working anymore and there's this burst of everything, how did you do that?
I don't think there's any elegant or right way to do it. I mean, because it is a breaking, it's messy, you know. And I think one of the things that I realised was that my self-control had been about containing this mess. You know, I believed that inside me there was this bad stuff that really people shouldn't see. Yeah. And so keeping the lid on that, keeping that hidden, was part of it. And there was really, I stumbled through it. You know, some days I could feel it and be with it. Some days I was completely beside myself. I think there's no easy, simple way to do that because of its nature. Yeah.
Okay. And I see. I also loved something else. I loved so many things, so I'm just going to quote half the book, so you don't summarize the whole book. But, you know, I like the when you use the word, I'm sorry for the mic, you use the word messy, because I can really relate to that. I don't know if other people can also relate to that. As soon as it becomes messy, and I can't control it, even not with my spiritual and stories, because I always have a story on some level. You know, how do you deal, you know, with the messiness
Yeah.
of life and just stay with that?
I think that's a huge question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean,
Can you give us a short answer which we can use?
Yeah, absolutely, and you'll all be
mess?
fine. I mean, at the time I crashed into the mess,
Yeah.
I really had no idea. So I tried all of those things
Yeah.
that I thought might help: the spirituality, the healing, all of that. And there were some useful things in there, but I think by definition, the dark night takes us beyond all of that. So there is a process of finding that all of those usual strategies just don't work anymore. Yeah. And that felt shameful. I felt like a real failure because there was a sense of I should be able to manage this. Yeah. And I'd spent 15 years working with other people in the clinic, you know, people who had huge trauma and all sorts of other things. And so I'd come to believe, well, if I can help other people, like, what's wrong with me? I should be able to sort this out by myself.
Yeah.
Now I think I'd have a very different answer to how to be with the messiness, because I understand much more that it isn't about trying to fix it or manage it. It's about finding our capacity to be with it as it is much more. And obviously, as we know, that in itself is also really challenging. So it's not like any of this is easy. Yeah. But I think there is something about dropping the trying to change it. Because I think the belief that what we're experiencing isn't okay is more pain on top of pain, isn't it? Yeah. So we feel the pain, but then we have all these beliefs about, you know, I shouldn't be feeling this, or there's something wrong with me for being like this. You know, I did an online book launch a few weeks ago, and I got a text from somebody afterwards that just said, "Thank you for making me feel normal." Yeah. And for me, that was so important, that in this broken place, for me, I thought I was the only person who was going through it.
Is that one of the reasons? Is that the reason you wrote the book?
It's a major reason why I wrote the book, yeah, because I thought, well, you know, if one person reads this book, that's one person who doesn't have to spend several years believing that there's something really wrong with them for experiencing this. So yeah, that was a big motivation.
Yeah, that's really, I mean, what I loved about the book is that sometimes you see, and I don't know what the truth of it is at the end of the day, but people that went to a spiritual, their dark night of the soul, and they come out of it, whatever coming out of it means, we're going to talk about that later, how your life is right now, but it's always that they put the conclusion there, and I lived happily ever after, and then the whole other part is more like, it's not written from a place of feeling the pain, but more of, yeah, I've been through that, and blah, 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 and now I'm here.
Yeah, I mean, I think those books are both inspiring and incredibly frustrating, aren't they? I mean, the number of books I read like that, where it was like, well, good for you, but how do I get from A to B? Yeah. You know, and it just seems really unfortunate that people aren't more honest about that. Yeah. Because I think for me, the spiritual journey is not to get out of all of that, but really to get right into it. Yeah. So I think there's a level of dishonesty about that kind of, well, I, you know, transcended all of that. I think you can find ways to remove yourself from it, yeah. But I don't think that's the same thing as actually integrating it. So I think often people may have experiences where they do seem to be sort of floating above, but then that's very disconnected from their bodies, from their real experience, and the real experience of life. I mean, if we can't be relating better, or you know, I mean, it's being in life fundamentally, isn't it, rather than removed from it in some way.
Yeah, I recognize that, and every time you do read it, you still think, oh yeah, that's where I can go to. And that's a place where I go there. I also get above life, and it's even more frustrating when you know it doesn't work, and you still feel very sad, or pain, or hurt, or...
Yeah.
So thank you for that. For writing it in a way that it's... yeah, you're just... where I can relate to your life. It feels very good.
Thank you.
Another thing I had in that chapter that I really liked, page 29, is, I'm not going to read all of it because it's a big part, but you say, I don't have to know anything. I don't have to try to understand quantum physics or mathematics. I don't have to know the prime minister's name or who won this year's Booker Prize. I don't have to know the names of the birds or trees or flower or fish. I don't need to know people's names or job titles, ages or places of birth. And then you say, I don't have to know why I do the things I do, or why I sometimes suffer. I don't need to be clever anymore. Maybe I'll work in a cake shop. Maybe I'll be a gardener's assistant and spend the day digging and watering and listening to birds. Maybe I'll walk other people's dogs. Just no more brain work. No more figuring things out or trying to be knowledgeable. I'm joyous at the thought of not being clever anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to add to that, that was a big part of my identity.
Yeah.
That from a very young age, really, probably from about 6 years old, this idea that I was clever. And in the context of my family, my mother had labelled all of us. So, you know, my eldest sister was the pretty one, the next sister was the practical one, I was the sort of clever but difficult, you know, and so on. So there'd been almost a kind of aggressively clever.
Yeah.
You know, where there, and I think also I would be in intellectual battle with the boys sometimes. It was like, I'm going to be as clever as anybody else.
Yeah.
And so there was a fighting for it often. So it was a huge relief when that came in.
Yeah. I really like that part too. And another question I had about that, being clever, analyzing things, being very good at analyzing and trying to analyze your way through life, is something you see, you know, a lot, especially with the highly educated people. Sometimes I feel it's even harder because or not harder, different. You have the sensitivity and all the things that make us humans, you know, all the emotions, and then you have a brain that thinks it can help you through life and do everything for you, and then those two things don't come along. How do you see that?
I mean, I think ultimately that attempt of the mind to help us out in that way is actually really beautiful. You know, I think there's a part later on in the book where I talk about, you know, the mind's really doing its best to help us out. So it's not that it's at any fault. It may go off at the wrong tangent and it doesn't always know what's right or more effective. But I think often it is really doing its best. And I think ultimately going through the dark night and being willing to be with ourselves, there is a kind of integration of mind and body that happens. Because when we're those analytical, well-educated people, we tend to be very cut off from our bodies, don't we, and our feelings. I was talking with a friend the other day, you know, and she said, I'm not really aware of anything below my neck. So it often all happens here, doesn't it? So I think we become more integrated. The mind can be relieved of having to sort it all out all the time. And we begin to tap into the intelligence in the body more.
And how do you think that How do you think that comes? You say our intellect is serving us, maybe even more when we were younger. How does that happen from using your intellect as serving you as a human being and serving the body until where you come to the other side where you forget about your body and only use the intellect to serve?
I think it comes from being, inevitably, this starts as children, obviously, that we encounter times when we simply cannot be with the feelings that we've got. We become really overwhelmed, or it's too painful, or we're not supported to feel what we're feeling. So in my case, for example, just one of the things that happened was that my parents separated when I was 11 or 12, and nobody actually talked to me about it at all. So there was no conversation about how is this for you, or how are you feeling. So the only way that my system could deal with it would be to think my way through it, because the feelings were too overwhelming and I couldn't share them with anybody. So I think slowly we start to mistrust feeling and our bodies, obviously, because that's what's doing the feeling. And we don't have support for that. We're not taught how to feel. We're not, unless we happen to study psychology, maybe then a bit, but again, that's more theoretical than it is practical. So we don't really have practical lessons in how to be with ourselves. And to learn that emotions are just part of being human. We're taught that, well, don't be scared, or don't cry, or we get all of those messages constantly. So I think the only option left at a certain point is to depend on our minds.
Yeah. And how, or could you relate that to like depression?
I think you could, yeah. I mean, my experience of depression has been within the context of the dark night. So I wouldn't say that I've been classically depressed in the normal way that people think of that. But I think there is something about numbing and cutting off, because we simply don't know how to feel. So we keep the lid on things. And of course, there's our aliveness is actually in our emotions, in a sense, isn't it? Along with everything else, our senses, our bodies. So if we're only really living from thinking, there is a kind of deadness to that, isn't there? That I think probably adds to depression.
After the fall, you go to the underworld for a while in your life.
Yeah.
You say, I disappeared below ground for long periods of time. The yang world of activity no longer made sense. Can you tell us more about your trip to the underworld?
Yeah. Well, at first, it was extremely disorientating, because I was so used, like everybody else is, to be in daily life when it's all about, job and what you're doing and so on. And it did actually feel quite dark at the beginning. There was a literal sense of being in the dark. And I think because our cultures are really very biased towards the light in different ways, aren't we? We don't talk about death very much. We don't talk about pain and illness and all of the things that eventually we all go through, actually. And we're also, spirituality tends to have this positivity to it, doesn't it? Be happy and all of that. So to be in the underworld, in the half that we usually ignore, was very difficult at first. After a while, I actually begun to like it at points, because there was a relief to it. It was like, I don't have to be all of that. So over time, there was a relief in it.
And how did the people around you respond to you when you were in that period?
It was mixed. It was very mixed. The partner that I was with at the time was convinced that I was depressed because I was menopausal. So there was which I was menopausal, but there was a lot of like, well, the thing is you're menopausal and you're depressed, and I would try and say I know that that's part of it, but that's definitely not all of it. A lot of people actually didn't really know. I mean, I didn't go into much detail with a lot of people. So I think the one person that really had insight into it was my son, who was about 15 or 16 at the time it started. So obviously I tried as much as I could to keep it, to shelter him from it. But obviously, I couldn't do that all the time.
But how did it show up in your life, this underworld period?
With not being able to function. So I didn't go to work for 4 years. I could just about do the domestic things, so the cooking and shopping and cleaning, although sometimes that was difficult. And after everybody else had gone to school and work, I would just spend long periods of time on my own. I didn't see many people at all. And I would either be feeling what was there or trying to not feel what was there in all sorts of different ways. I walked quite a lot, so just around the streets in the city where I live. I listened to music quite a lot, wrote. I tried to sometimes meditate, but that was difficult. So all sorts of things at different times.
And what kind of feelings? Are we talking like fear, or were there also terror, or what were the things you can remember were very intense for you at that moment?
What was most intense was a feeling which was like a combination of anguish and terror. That was really intense, particularly at night. There was a lot of grief at various times. I think the anxiety would go up when I wasn't really feeling the emotion. So it would get worse and worse and worse. And then when there was some emotion, the anxiety would lessen a bit. Shame, anger at points. I mean, I had no idea it was possible to cry that much. I mean, there was just every day, nearly every day, crying. Sometimes I didn't actually know what I was feeling. So it wasn't always possible to, it wasn't necessarily a logical thing of like, oh, well, I'm feeling shame and it would just be, what's this?
Yeah. And how was it staying with that? Because, also if you look at all the spiritual books, the easiness is not only just look at your thoughts and the monkey mind, and it's also stay with what you feel. And I'm like, you did not feel what I just felt, if else you would not say that so easily. How did you deal with the brain that's just the shame and the stories and the failure, and at the same time the extreme emotions of anger, anguish?
I mean, ultimately, I really had to give up any idea of dealing with it, because all the attempts to deal with it, like I was saying before, just failed. So at some point, I had to at the beginning, it was tiny, tiny moments of trusting, because I worked out that this wasn't something I was doing. It was more like I was being done. So, it was doing me rather than me somehow. So, and obviously this happened over time, and sometimes it was there and sometimes not. Sometimes I would be things because I had no choice. I think most of the time it was because there was just no choice. So the feelings would just be so overpowering that, I mean, I was telling Anna and Simon a couple of days ago that my partner was Buddhist at the time, and the Dalai Lama came to Nottingham, and he said, like, we've got to go to the Dalai Lama. And so I sat in this big stadium, 3,000 people all going like, wow, it's the Dalai Lama, that's amazing. Just sitting there, just crying. And I was like, well, I would have been crying at home, I'm just crying here. no difference. He seems like a really nice man, but I mean, it was meaningless in a sense.
There was
because
not joy coming over you.
No. I mean, the only comfort was I knew that the Dalai Lama himself probably would have just gone, "Oh, you're crying, okay," you know. But there was nothing that touched it in that sense. That when the crying was there, it was just there.
Yeah. And one other question about the people around you, like what kind of, did you also experience people being okay with your emotions, or people trying to get you out of them? Like, how did that go? And
most of the time, I was just on my own.
okay.
So I think there were one or two friends who didn't try to get me out of it, but mostly I just didn't share it. As I said, my partner would try to get me out of it. But I really didn't share very much with people because one of the fears was, and I've talked to many other people who had this, if you're really going to talk about what's here, they're going to think you're completely nuts. So there wasn't, I was very cautious about opening up any of it because I thought, if I really tell people the truth here, A, they're going to run, and B, maybe they'll try and do something with me, that I don't want them to do.
Because that is a hard part, people that love you, we talk about not wanting to get somebody out of a situation, but if it's a loved one, it's also really hard just to stay and not do anything.
Yeah. And I was really aware of how hard it was for them, which was one of the reasons why I tried to not hide it from them, but time it so that they weren't around. Or, sometimes I'd even make jokes about it. So I tried to make it lighter in a way for them as well as for me.
Yeah. So the next part of your journey, you call the unraveling. So you're in the underworld for a while, and then you unravel, and you, I don't know which page that was, but you say, it seems like you get more interest in who you are and in the curiosity and your persona. You say about it filter what comes and goes out, trying to protect us from potential perceiving and actual harm. It represses the mess and chaos within and attempts to control the flow of life. Can you tell more about that phase?
Yeah. So after the falling apart, I think what happens is that we get to see what it is that's fallen apart. So what is that mask or persona doing? And as I say, I think it's making sure that the me that we show to the world is acceptable. It's how it's supposed to be, and I don't just mean that in a shallow way. I think there's quite a depth to that. And I think it's also necessary in the sense that we can't be fully open and sensitive all the time. I think that's not advisable, is it? We need to have boundaries. We need to have some sensitivity about where we're open and how we're open, so that obviously we're not harmed in any way. So that unraveling process, I think, was really about seeing all of the parts of me and what they'd been doing and how they fitted together and how they interrelated, and all the beliefs that came with that. So one of the beliefs that I talk about, that I saw in that unraveling phase, was that deep down I'd always felt like it was my fault. So whenever anything was happening, particularly in conflict with people, there would be this underlying sense, it's my fault. And obviously sometimes I would be trying to prove it wasn't my fault. But that was there on a very deep level all of the time. So to see, I think once we start to see those beliefs in a deeper way than purely intellectually, we begin to feel the belief in a way, and what that has cost us, and what that has, the kind of behaviour that leads to, it has the chance to start to fall away in some way.
How did you find out? How did you find out this particular?
It just came to, that unravelling phase, things would just come. So I might be, sometimes I would just sit, maybe with some music on, and there'd be emotion, and then thoughts, realizations would just come. So again, it wasn't a question of working it out. It was like just a seeing, like, oh, there might be words or images. Sometimes there'd be memories. Looking at something and suddenly saying, like, whoa, I thought it was my fault. So there's a spontaneity about that, as there is with the whole process, that even though it's painful, there is that deep insight and realization that comes in, again, without any effort. I think from just, that's partly what the process is. So that there's nothing, in a sense, there's nothing we need to do, which again is deeply frustrating on one level, but on another level it's really relieving, because it doesn't take any work to kind of dig in. It's not like we have to go digging for the beliefs. Does that?
Yes, but how did you know that it was like an old overtuiging,
Conviction.
old conviction? Like, so the thought would come up, it's my fault. And how would you know? How would you like not connect it to something you had done that day? How would you know? This is. I have thought this since I was 6.
Yeah.
How would you know?
It was because that knowing came with the insight. So both as a feeling, often a feeling like that has a sense of like, wow, this has always been here, and memories. So often a series of memories. So in my experience, particularly with my experience since then, we can actually get really specific about when something started. We can see a memory, a moment in time, go, whoa, okay. And often there's deep feeling attached to that. And part of the insight or the realization is seeing, it wasn't my fault. So it's not simply seeing the belief itself, but the seeing also unpicks it. So then obviously there's the emotion of, oh, it wasn't my fault. So it wasn't my fault that my parents split up. It wasn't my fault that, my friend died, etc., etc. So again, it's not, there is really no thinking involved apart from the thoughts that come as part of the insight. Does that make sense? Yeah, great.
And how, from that question, how would one do it when you don't get that insight in a natural order, and you have all these unconscious beliefs that are creating a lot of the suffering?
Yeah.
How would you go to them?
Well, I think the first thing to say, I think I might be misquoting Jung here, but I think apparently he said something like, the problem with the unconscious is that it's unconscious. And that's the thing. I think we can be open and willing to look at ourselves in some way. So whether that's inquiry or therapy or all the different ways that we can do that, we can be open and willing to do that. We can't determine what will become conscious when. So it's a constant source of amazement to me that as we keep on looking, we get to see all sorts of different layers and beliefs at different times. And sometimes even the same belief at different layers or at different levels. So we can't plan or predict how that's going to be. And sometimes still, as you know, I'm still doing my own work, my own looking. And sometimes I have an insight and think, how have I not become conscious of that before? Like, that's so obvious. but that's the nature of becoming conscious.
Yeah.
I mean, if we think of the spiritual journey as becoming conscious, you know, if we think of waking up as becoming aware, then that can only be a process, you know, in terms of things coming into consciousness.
Yeah.
So I think that in that sense, there isn't an end point to it, where we go, well, I'm just conscious of everything now. Well, of course you're not, you know, because that's not how we work. You know, we're limited kind of systems in minds and bodies with all those sort of, with the limitations of that, as well as being part of whatever we call this, you know, universal consciousness or those kinds of words. So yeah, we can't decide to become conscious of something.
But is there a part what you started with that you did, as I heard you, like a willingness
Willingness, yeah.
to look at,
Yeah.
to search, not even to search, to inquire, even though you don't know what you're gonna find.
Yeah,
A certain curiosity of
exactly.
what is there in my inner world that I can still find out.
Exactly. I mean, that's what all of us share, besides a lot of other things. We're all here because we already have that. If we weren't curious and willing, this would not resonate. So I think fundamentally, in a sense, we have, but that's probably our one choice, isn't it? Am I going to be willing to be open and curious and see, or not? And it can change hour by hour or minute by minute sometimes, can't it? You know, sometimes it's like, I'm not looking at that. I'm going to go and watch TV or have a drink. But I think overall in our lives, we can have a sense of, yes, my path is to be open and willing to be open.
Yeah.
And that includes times when we're resistant or closed, or, you know, it's not like we have to be open and willing all the time.
Yeah, so willing to be open is to inquire, but also willing to be open that if your system wants to watch 3 seasons of a Netflix show,
Totally.
then that's okay too. Then you're just seeing that happening.
Exactly. So there are so many ways in which we can get ideas about how we're supposed to do this. You know, at some point, as I'm sure all of us here have, I'd read a lot about presence, and you've got to be present, you've got to be here now, blah blah blah. And so I had this sudden moment of thinking, well, how can you make yourself more present? Like, you're already present. That's it. We're here. And obviously, you know, you could talk about distraction and thought and things like that, but fundamentally, we are here. Yeah. And the more ideas we have about how we're supposed to be here, kind of the more complicated it seems to be. So if we think that, yeah, we can't watch 3 seasons of Netflix, and I watched so much TV in the dark night. And I still, you know, I still watch quite a bit now. Yeah. You know, I think using those.
Note to everyone, it's okay. To watch TV.
You know, and I think it's having that, along with the openness and willingness. Gradually, I think we do develop some compassion for ourselves. Yeah. Not because we're trying to be compassionate, but we start to see like really.
You are what you are at that moment.
Exactly, and if that means, you know, I can understand why anybody does anything. You know, drug taking, drinking, you know, all of the stuff that we do to try to not be here. Totally understand it, because if you're in touch with your own pain, how can you not know how really hard it is to feel it? Yeah. And I think anybody who's willing to be even the slightest bit curious about that is really brave.
Another part, there are different stuff I want to talk about now, but like the persona or the ego. You also read in the books, as you can hear, everybody, I'm tired of all those books, get rid of the ego. And I'm like, okay, how do you do that? Like, this is my personality, and it's been with me 36 years now. So how, we started before with the intellect, and I loved how you said, you honor it because it has helped you through many stuff. How do you look at the persona from that? You know, the image of the world. Like I'm wearing my power half suit. We are humans.
Yeah.
And part of the persona is part of it. How do you look at that subject?
Yeah. I think in very much the same way there's an honouring of it. Because it's amazing, isn't it? You know, that we're all utterly unique. There's a part in the book where I say something like, I looked it up and 107 billion people have ever lived in the entire history of the world. And all of them completely unique. I mean, that is mind-blowing, isn't it? That how could we have a problem and say, well, you have to get rid of this thing called the ego because there's some... And I think when you start to explore it, you see that even though sometimes it can be very harsh, very destructive, and we've all had that inner critic stuff. I mean, I had it very powerfully. When we really start to meet it, we see again it's really trying to save us. You know, and there are a couple of conversations in the book that I had between kind of me and my ego in a way, where it's saying like, oh my God, I've been trying to keep you protected and safe, and you keep on going off and doing this. Like, what are you doing? You've had me so worried. And I think it's trying to make sure that we fit in, that we're acceptable to the outside world. I think the more we meet that, the more we honour it, the more... I think in many ways this is the journey of just becoming more sane, so that we become more integrated, we become more healthy, and obviously a healthy persona is necessary for functioning in the world, isn't it? So I think it's unfortunate that the ego, and I think we could have all sorts of discussions about what that means, but in spiritual teaching often it's saying, yeah, it's terrible and we have to get rid of it, and I think that sets up a lot of problems really, because then there's a constant questioning, isn't there? Like, was that my ego? I put on makeup, was that my ego? You know, and I think that's really quite unhelpful.
Yeah. So you say it saves us and it serves us.
It serves us. It does its best given the blueprint that it had, given that, you know, it comes obviously from our upbringing, from our culture, from the family system, from all sorts of different places. I think it really does its best. And I think this process is actually a relief to the ego, because it's not then trying to live up to its own ideal.
Yeah.
You know, it can then be let off the hook, that it doesn't have to be what it thought it had to be.
Yeah. Because you mean like, if your ego is a story you live by right now, if you're just looking for another story, and you're telling your ego, well, the story you're having right now is not the right one, instead of just being the story that it wants to be right now.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how do you, because words that are used in the spiritual community a lot are like ego, but also connection and consciousness and love. And I always feel, if I read about it, for myself also, it's sometimes always not a struggle, but you know, you have the connection that we feel and the love that we feel through it, but at the same time, like somebody as Tim Freak will say, I am human, and I have this me. I have my own thoughts that nobody else can see. I have this diversity in me. So how do we connect that, finding ourselves in others in love, but also being yourself and your own story in this world?
I mean, Tim Freak does a great job of that. I mean, I think we probably do it by sharing. I mean, I think that's one of the key ways of doing it, that when we're meeting each other as completely equal, you know, different expressions of that diversity that you described, then there's nobody more conscious, less conscious, more loving, less loving. You know, we're all this mix, and I think meeting in that place is probably one of the most powerful things that we can do, and meeting really from a place of honesty about, well, how is it for me? How is it for you?
Yeah.
You know, that there isn't, that in a way there isn't, although our experiences obviously are so different, there isn't really better or worse in that on some level. You know, obviously some experiences are worse and more painful than others, but that there isn't a judgment around that. And I think that willingness to be honest about what's really here, but obviously, you know, again, not necessarily when you're on the bus or, you know, but in settings like this is really, really, really powerful.
Yeah, and then the shame can come up.
Exactly, and I think shame is really what prevents us from doing that, isn't it? There's a part in the book where I'm saying, in the early part of The Dark Night, I imagined that whatever was behind my mask was so awful, so dirty or disgusting, or that there was so much shame about that, that if somebody really saw what I was actually like, you know, everybody would want to go. And I think to some degree or another, we all share that shame, because I think it's part of the structure of the persona to feel that shame of itself.
Yeah, I saw that also was one of the quotes I wanted to read is, well, you said it yourself about the shame. You say, I'm so tired, I'm so ashamed. That's why I've kept the walls up. That's why I've pushed people away, kept them at a distance so that they don't see inside. The emptiness, the mess, the dirt, the bareness, the disarray. If I really let anyone in, they'll see the truth.
Yeah. And I think I think many of us, certainly for me, I had two opposite pulls. I really, really longed for deep connection. And I think obviously all of us have that deep longing for real, true connection. And I was also utterly terrified of it. So I think it's that almost the impossibility of wanting something and simultaneously being terrified of it. And I think that's also applies to other parts of The Dark Night, that we really long to be our real selves, and we're terrified of it simultaneously. So it's kind of the journeying through that.
Yeah. Yeah, of course.
First of all, I'm very impressed by your story.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, true.
You said that after about 4 years you started your inquiry. Looking back, what caused you to start that overcoming of this fear after 4 years and not after 1 year or 20 years in your particular case?
I don't think there was a particular reason for that. I mean, one of the things that I've learned about The Dark Night, particularly from knowing many other people and working with other people who've gone through it, is that everybody has their own timing and different things happen at different times. So that was the sequence for me. I mean, there was a kind of very basic form of inquiry happening even in the first 4 years, although I didn't even know the word inquiry, but that was actually what was happening. I happened to meet people who were doing it. I happened to, just come across other kind of teachings or methodologies, and I think also the intensity was just beginning to lessen at that time. I think when it was really intense, it was very difficult to do anything. But what I don't know is how it would have been had I had that at the beginning. So I think it's really, I don't think there's any real cause and effect. I think it seems to come in a different order for each person.
Did you have contact with any professionals, mental health professionals, or?
Yeah, I did. I did. I had contact with one homeopath who actually was the one person who did understand what was happening from the beginning. And I did have psychotherapy for about 18 months, about 2 or 3 years in, which was kind of helpful-ish. I mean, I think what was more helpful was actually just somewhere where I could go and be for an hour a week, or I went every 2 weeks. But you know, just to have a room to sit down in, to just go, that was helpful. I don't know that it mattered too much who was sitting on the other chair, as long as they were present. It didn't. I don't think it really made much difference what they did. So I also saw professionals who tried to fix me, and that didn't work well at all. So I think we just find or reach for people at different times, and to some extent I think it's just about trusting the process to move as it does. Yeah. One of the things I say in the book several times is there's no formula, there's no prescription. We just can't apply that to it. So I couldn't say to anybody else, oh well, you need to do this, this, and this, because you know, who knows what their journey will be. But I do think that when we're with somebody who understands the nature of the landscape, that definitely helps. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, another thing I recognize is also the value of support because of that shame. I remember for myself, and still, the more things are coming up about me feeling like a bad person, or my procrastination, like the things I'm ashamed of, I do remember that when I started sharing with my friends, but especially also with Anna, who does the same inquiries and works with me, and I could go to her on Monday morning and just like say all the things my mind told me, and her just responding like very loving, and that's okay, and I having stuff that have to do with my identity and past, and her having her stuff, and just saying it out loud, and somebody just not running away was just like, it had such a huge impact in a way I don't think I could ever have that if I was on my own, because you need that realization that another person will accept you for it. So, yeah.
Definitely, yeah. And
so thanks, Anna.
Yeah.
And my other friends, of course.
Yes, I think that kind of support is really, really valuable. And I was aware that I didn't have it in the beginning part. I know the huge difference it makes, and I think it's such a relief when we share how we are, and there's no attempt to make it okay. You know, there's no like, well, what you need to do is, you know, and I think that's something my clients say a lot to me, is like, oh, you didn't try and change or fix or give advice. Yeah. And I think fundamentally that's what we want. We want it to be okay to be us.
Yeah. And another part we also talked about that Friday that I recognize now, I try to be more in awareness sometimes, is just the craziness of your inner world. Like Monday morning, you're depressed. Wednesday evening, I think I'm one with the world. Thursday afternoon, I'm crying. 3 days, I'm okay. Then I watch Netflix for 4 hours, and I don't want to go. So it just goes like.
It's totally.
If you, how do you look at that?
Yeah. I think that becomes more and more okay. Yeah. I mean, my sense of the Dark Night and this whole awakening process, if we want to call it that, is that things just become more and more okay. Yeah. So we don't have that thing of like, oh, it's Monday morning, I'm depressed. I really shouldn't be depressed. What's wrong with me? I should be, you know. It's just like, oh. And there's a sense for me now that there's more of a kind of a commentary that just goes, oh, so we're watching Netflix today. Okay. Or, happiness. Yeah. Who knew? You know, so there's much less, there's an openness to like whatever's coming through without that layer of judgment. And I think I told you, you know, one week on the Monday, I was sitting and there was just huge love and, you know, surrender, and it was really kind of blissful. And on the Wednesday, there was just, I'm not forgiving, I'm not accepting, you know. I mean, we're like, well, how do you measure that? Is it Monday or Wednesday? You know, and I think we have all of those things in us, don't we? So I think once we see, in a sense, once we see we're not this thing that we thought we were, this very clearly defined thing with a set of beliefs, and once that widens out, then we can be so much more in a way, can't we? It's like, oh, well, there you go, I can be angry. So we discover these parts of ourselves, I think. And I've seen, you know, people who were very mild-mannered and calm discover their rage in the dark night. Or, you know, I knew somebody who was, you know, who'd been a soldier. He was a strong alpha male who just was in total fear in the dark night, crying. So we discover anything that we've said that we're not, basically. And that means that we've got, it's like being able to paint in a lot more colours, really, isn't it? You know, that we can be all of those things, and it's all part of us, and it's all okay.
Yeah. Then my other question would be, sometimes when you get in those emotions, you think you are those emotions. Sometimes that's the hard part, because when you're very sad or you're angry, sometimes the fear is that it will never go away and you'll stay angry, or you really feel that you think you are that at that moment. How would you look at that, and how can you deal with that?
Yeah. I think one of the ways of dealing with that is the willingness to feel the feeling, because I think once you feel the feeling and you recognise that there is a collection of things here, there's a feeling, it's in the body, it's in a particular place in the body often. There are words, there's some sort of narrative there. There are often images, things that, you know, you imagine like, well, how is it going to be when I meet them tomorrow? Or you run over old stuff, don't you, whether it's yesterday or 10 years ago. I think once you become more aware of that, you start to see, as you were saying, you start to see how rapidly things actually change. And I think after a while you get wise to that you might be in, you know, deep sadness in this moment. And I think the more you're willing to feel the sadness, paradoxically, we're scared that if we really let ourselves go into it, it'll never stop. Yeah. What we find is actually the opposite, that the more willing we are to feel it, the more it moves through or opens out in a different way. So I think again, it's the willingness to inquire, to be curious about what's going on. Yeah.
Because I even remember one time inquiring, and there was another, I don't even know, but a truth I had that I felt was very important. And one of the questions was, can you let it go? And I really felt such deep fear of, no, if I let this go, I'll die. Like, what am I if I am not also this part of the story? What am I? So there was such a profound fear of dying. Like, do you recognize that?
I totally recognise that, yeah. I mean, just to say, in the dark night in general, I had a profound fear of death, which I think is fairly common in the dark night. Because you could say, with the falling apart of the persona, if when that's what we think we are, it does feel like a death in a sense. And just as you say, there's a sense of, well, if I'm not this Fiona who's clever and feels like it's her fault and all the other things we've mentioned, if I'm not that, then what's left? And so it can absolutely feel like death. I mean, for quite a long time, when I went to sleep at night, I didn't believe that I would wake up. So I think we gradually come to see, and this is very experiential, isn't it? I mean, I think we can't think ourselves into this place. I think all we can do is trust the moment by moment experience we have, that, oh, I felt that feeling, and I'm actually still here, and it was okay, and nobody rejected me.
Yeah.
And just relearn, like, oh, it's actually safe to feel this. It's okay to be me.
Yeah.
Because at the time, you know, when we were very young children, for whatever reason it was in our own individual histories, it wasn't okay to feel those feelings. It wasn't okay to be us.
Yeah, I read one time in a book, and it really stayed with me, and it said that there are some about our persona and our coping mechanism, and that there are cases of children committing suicide, and that are children that didn't develop those coping strategies, and then they felt maybe the painfulness of life and abandonment of everything. So that really stayed with me, of what you said about honoring the coping, honoring the persona, or honoring the ego, for it letting you deal with the painfulness of life.
Absolutely. And I think there's a deep intelligence to it, so that our own personas develop in kind of a perfect way for us and our circumstances. And I think the other thing that our being does is hold the pain safe until we can come back to it. So I think there's something really precious about that. You know, when we talk about the pain, it's not simply that there's this, you know, pain and it's awful. I think there's something really profound in the pain, because what happens as we feel that is that we reconnect with our, what I call in the book, our real self. And I guess by that I mean our essential kind of Zara-ness or Fiona-ness, you know, that spark of what we were when we were little children. And we see that, don't we? I mean, I found I became funnier. I became more silly.
Yeah.
You know, that there was a willingness to reconnect with these other parts. So it's not simply that the pain is in there.
Yeah.
It's actually, you know, I began writing again. I hadn't written for 40 years when I started writing again 7 years ago. So there's a creativity that also gets locked down in there. And when the more we feel the pain, my sense is the more we connect with that deeper creativity of ourselves, however that is for us.
I wanted to quote another thing that I loved before we go to the pain, because the pain has its own chapter. You say, "No wonder life has been hard. Such huge unrealistic expectations and pressures so much of the time. To be a perfect girl, clever girl, thin girl, popular girl, good girl, right girl. I turned my back on me. I tried to not be like me. Me was such a painful place to be, and I just wasn't perfect enough. It's been so long since I've been me. I've missed my meanness. Meanness, sorry.
Yeah.
It's been so exhausting being her, such weight of expectation, perfection. I don't want to be her anymore. I've longed to be me, but haven't known how to stop being her. Now I'm finding the path of least resistance." I really like that. Least resistance. Because I recognize, you know, a lot in what you say right now, the perfection of... Because I had like an example, I was in a club and I was dancing on the stage, because that's my inner Beyonce, and I was doing that, and I was having such a great time. It was just at that moment, it was perfect. And then afterwards, I had this emotional like hangover, and I was like, yeah, but why would you do that? And weren't you seen enough as a child? And I was like, at the end, I was like, who cares? Maybe it has to do that I didn't feel seen as a child. I enjoyed it at that moment. So I really recognize that sometimes, even if you're in your spiritual or psychological journey, you still create images of how you want to be, and you're not okay with the person you are right now. That is at that moment, you are what you are, with all of the messiness and all of the coping mechanism. That is also who you are at that moment.
Totally.
So I recognize that even when we're trying to be more of who we are, we're still trying to be something else.
I think the key word there is trying.
Yeah.
I mean, I think wherever there's trying, there's something potentially to look at, because there's some sort of effort towards trying to be something, and then there's an image of the something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Instead of just being whatever you
Yeah.
feel.
Like you said, in the moment when you were dancing, it was great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So, to the next part. So the last thing I wanted to ask about the persona, yeah, you hear the things of like the death of the ego. As I hear you, you look at it a bit different. There's
Yeah.
nothing to kill.
I love that. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. There's nothing to kill. Totally. I think there is probably something to integrate, because some parts of ourselves we've really distanced from or cut off from. We've favoured other parts, but definitely nothing to kill.
Okay, good to know that. Another big part besides the persona, that as I hear you, the persona just develops as it develops through time. Something's added, something's lost, and now you have a few years you want to be identified with this group and others that group. There's no badness in that. Another big subject is pain. I think for all of us it is a big subject. As you started in this society, we try to go away from pain. We want to go to happiness, or as we would say in Dutch, superleuk. That's pretty much where we want to go. But how do we deal with the pain?
I mean, I think that's a huge question, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the brief answer would be to be with it the best we can in the kindest way possible.
Yeah.
So sometimes I found there were days when I was with it, when I was, you know, very much in the emotion, and there was inevitably some relief in that. And there were also days when the kindest thing would be to not try to be in it. And I think this whole message, like you were saying, you know, just feel the feelings, just feel that. Well, actually, some days there's almost like a harshness or a punishment to that. Like you'll be sitting there forcing yourself into feeling feelings, when the kindest thing to do on that particular day might just be go for a walk, or, you know, just do something else. So I think over the course of the dark night, we do become much more able to be present to ourselves. So we do develop the capacity to stay with feelings and so on. But I think the more kindness we can bring to that, the better. And sometimes that's possible, and sometimes it's not. You know, sometimes we need to get that. We get that from somebody else, like you were saying. Yeah. Because obviously our inner landscape, particularly when we're in pain, can be bleak.
I do recognize with the inquiries that I had with the facilitations by you, for example, there was such a fear to go in that pain. Sometimes it was just a physical sensation in your body at the end, and it was in my heart, and I actually felt like I was having a heart attack, and or the beginning of it, and it was really for me a big eye opener. Only facilitated, because I could never do that by myself, like never, to really feel that, and then afterwards I just didn't die.
Yeah.
Do you have similar experiences? Or?
Absolutely. I mean, I think as we're in this falling apart of the persona, we're right at the edges of ourselves in a way, aren't we? We're right at the point where if I go past this point, I'll die. Or so I think, and like you said, the persona was formed in the first place because we didn't have the capacity to feel what was there. It was far too overwhelming. So I think it's very natural that happens, that it feels like we won't come back from it, or that we'll die. And again, I think once we've experienced that more than, once or more, we start to very slowly have a bit more confidence about that. And I think, again, you know, that's the value in doing that with somebody else in some way, whether it's inquiry or some other type of work, or even, as you were saying, you know, with a friend. I think there's something really powerful about somebody else there beside us.
Yeah. Thank you. So before I go to the former subject, if I hear you, it's in a way just being curious what you are at that moment and being honest to yourself. If you feel like going through something or pain or anything, that's okay. And if it's really honoring yourself.
Yeah, I think honouring yourself and honesty is huge, because again, there's so many layers about what we think we're supposed to be doing, what we think we're supposed to be. And you know, one of the things in the spiritual world that's often said is like, well, you accept everything and surrender. Yeah, I just accept it. And I think that's obviously that's great if there's a genuine acceptance there. That's fine. But I think often when the real honest answer is no, that's unacceptable, there's such a relief in being able to say that. And that came up for me a few months ago. I was looking at something and thinking, actually, that's just not acceptable. And then I asked myself, well, is it acceptable that I find that unacceptable? And the answer was, yeah. I was like, whoa, okay, that's great. It's acceptable that I find that unacceptable. Fantastic. So we take these very simple ideas and then turn them into a kind of must. You know, I must accept everything. No, what? Who says that everything should be acceptable? Of course, that's ridiculous. So I think then we can start to liberate ourselves from those ideas. Yeah. You know, I can remember one day I was walking around all day just going, I don't want that, I don't want that, I don't want that, you know. And so we can start to overturn all of those sort of spiritual ideas about how things are supposed to be.
Yeah. That's very wise. I recognize it with anger. I have a bit of difficulty with anger. And then I just let that, I'm still in the process, I'm like at the early stages. And just being angry, because I didn't allow myself to be angry, because in my head I created all of these stories of what could have happened. Then I wouldn't be in connection with a person, then that person wouldn't like me, then like it's almost that the world would collapse.
Yeah.
If somebody didn't agree with me. And it's still a way work in progress to just be angry, and at that moment the person not liking you, and that's okay. That's just very, it changes your whole paradigm in a way.
Yeah.
Because you always had this reality, and then you experiment with it and you do it in a different way, because you never did it that way because you had such a story around it of, if I do this, the world would be too small. And then you do it, and then the world is still there.
Yeah.
And people like you even more because you're not pleasing them and they feel your authenticity.
Exactly.
So
yeah.
The next part I want to talk about, I didn't even tell you guys how long this would take.
Yeah. How are we doing?
I'm not a good
how are we doing
programmer,
for time?
presenter.
10 past.
How long do we have?
What was? 23.
Time is an illusion.
Yeah. so maybe if we just do like 2-3 more minutes, and then we can.
Well, I was at the ending of the subject because there was still one chapter. I really loved those chapters. That's why I went through them, because they're very recognizable. So we talked about not losing your persona, but just inquiring into it and looking if it serves you or not, and just being more flexible about it. Then we talked about that our persona and ego structure is there to help us. But if we lose that, then I love the next chapter that it's called trust. Because if I cannot, you say at a certain point, the development of the persona tends to result in a lack of trust. Maybe you can tell us more about that.
So my sense is that persona doesn't trust life in a very deep way, and often doesn't trust other people either. So it doesn't imagine that things will be okay unless it manages and controls and fixes and all of that. So the idea of, and I'm not talking about, you know, not turning up on time for things, or obviously there's a degree of management that we all need in life, but on those deeper levels, I think we don't trust that things will be okay. And in my experience, that in a way that kept life quite small. You know, I mean, if somebody had said to me 10 years ago, in 10 years' time, you will be in Amsterdam, having had, I mean, it would have completely blown my mind. And I can't tell you how easy it was for this to come together in a way. And yet, it's only by that trust coming in that this kind of thing is started, you know, it can begin to happen. So I think one of the things that I realised that my own limited ability to conceive of things is actually very limiting. If I don't trust life, then I just get that in a way. I think the development of trust that came through in the Dark Night isn't something that you can start to do mentally. It's just something that started to come through. I think, frankly, because you start to see, like, oh, I'm still here. I've actually survived this. And then you survive again the next day. Wow, okay, I've survived again. You know, and it builds, that experience of surviving, it builds. And then there's a sense of, like, there is actually some deep intelligence in this that has nothing to do with my intelligence in that sense. It's a much deeper sort of body or life intelligence. And beginning to trust that, I think, is more profound. Then it becomes more okay whatever happens. You know, whether 5 people turn up or 40 people turn up, it's okay. So, yeah, I think that again begins to come in slowly.
Now do you look at, I just think also on a more level on the society, where we all tell each other, you know, you are responsible for your own future. And I see students right now that I talk to that are 18 that are so afraid to pick the wrong first job. Because if they pick the wrong first job, they carry the weight of destroying their whole future, which is quite a lot to bear on your own shoulders.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we have this, in our society, we have this very linear view, don't we? That you say, you know, you go to school, you map it all out from 18, it's all supposed to flow in a certain way. And I think it's partly just having the courage to break out of that, isn't it? Trusting that even though you may have not done that, and being willing to feel the feelings of failure that come with that. I mean, there have been so many times I've felt like a failure, particularly, you know, in comparison to other people I know, or one of my sisters who had that very, you know, the marriage and the house and that kind of structured life. I wish there was a way in which we could convey to younger people that it is okay to be messy. And maybe that will start to happen because, as we know, the structures of life are beginning to fall apart a bit in the world, aren't they? You know, we're seeing change and old institutions. You know, a lack of trust, for example, in the church or government, and all those big structures are beginning to fall apart, aren't they?
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah. And you also see only nearby yourself with people around you, we do try to control it, make the right steps, pick the right person. So much freedom of choice also.
Yeah.
So you cannot even rationalize all those choices because there are too many.
Yeah.
There's no, where do you start? And,
Yeah.
that it leads to burnout, to we try to control it as the best as we can, and I think evolutionary we are at our prime, and still we cannot control it.
Yes.
So,
well, I think we've become to depend far too heavily on rationality, haven't we? We've prized intellectualism and rationality over everything else in a way, haven't we? So we can. I mean, I was saying the other day that we can actually think that we're doing something we can think that we're doing something really rational, and actually we're doing something quite insane, because we're very good at kind of talking ourselves around to using rationality, aren't we?
Yeah, I saw a beautiful movie, the German movie, I forgot its name, about the Second World War, and it was, for me, it was, but, oh yeah, and it was very, very, for me, not liberating, but aware, because we like to think that Nazis and people that are part of the NSB are different people than us, you know, that we're the good people and they're the bad people. We would all be in the resistance. Yeah, right. And then it was really nice to see that the craziness of that culture at that moment in time, how people, we can rationalize everything. That was my awareness at that moment. If we really want to, we can rationalize dehumanizing others, we can rationalize everything.
Yeah. And I think the only, you know, we have to be open at looking at all of those possibilities in ourselves. We can't simply say, like you said, you know, well, I'm a really liberal, nice person, so, you know, that doesn't happen to me. Yeah. I think that is probably one, in a sense, the only responsibility we have is to be aware of ourselves and our part in things.
Yeah. Like you quoted Jung, to really also be aware of all your sides, also your shadow sides, because they're all a part of who we are.
Completely.
Okay. Are there any questions? Yes. No questions? Oh, no questions. Any? Yeah. Okay, I'll bring you the mic. Thank you.
Hello. You told earlier that your partner thought you were in the menopause, and I was just thinking, you got into this depression deeply when you were like late 40s, beginning 50s.
Yeah, I mean, I was actually going into the menopause, so that was all.
But I was I was wondering, isn't it a really important, especially for women, transformational period in your life where you cannot hide your real self anymore?
Totally.
So it's like a good thing to learn to say to all the younger people, women especially here, that don't worry, it will come good after your menopause. It's not too bad. But the only thing you have to do, and you did it, is to take time for it, go into nature, go into yourself. But it's a good thing also to have your ration thing before that, because it brings you to where you are that day. You have your children, you have your house, you have your everything. But don't you think we need to say those younger people that they don't have to worry, because you will transform to the real you anyway in your 50s, and then you have the rest of your life being yourself
we just
anyway.
have to wait 20 years.
So I think for me that was the timing. It's not for everybody. So I know a lot of people, much younger people, who go through the dark night transformation, just as I know many women who have gone through menopause without transforming. So I think it's a very different process for everybody. For me, it was just as you describe, but I know many women who just that was not their experience of menopause at all.
Yeah, you checked your hormones also about it, if it was that thing also going on or not.
It was very obvious that it was, and I also had a thyroid disorder. So for me, that was the combination of events that came together. I know much younger people who've gone through that because something else has happened in their lives, or so I think there's no. I think it's impossible to really place the dark night in any one part of life. I think my sense is that it could come really at any time, and the process of aging can also be deeply transformational, absolutely. But as I say, I think it can be anywhere in that kind of spectrum. Certainly, I know people in their 20s who have gone through it as well as much later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just wanted to say that anyway, you cannot hold it anymore in your menopause anyway.
Exactly. Although interestingly, I do know some women who have. So for us, there was absolutely no possibility of holding it very much so. So there's
It's not like
and
a
obviously
rule.
no. And I think obviously everybody's deepening into life as they age in their own way. But I think that's a very different process to this kind of dark night, deep transformation that, as you and I would understand it. Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
Oh, there's another
Oh, there's
question
another
there.
one.
Yay.
Thank you for sharing your journey, your
Thank you.
personal journey. I think my question is related to the prior question. You described the Saturn's return in your late 20s
Oh,
and
yeah.
starting of 30s. How is it comparable? Maybe to explain, it's a phase I think you were in that was less dark in a way.
Yeah.
And how is it comparable, and what is the difference?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So for anybody who didn't get that, I refer in the book to going through what's often called the Saturn return, which happens in about 28, 29. I think the Saturn return was almost like a practice run, in a way. So that during that time was really the first time. That was really when the spiritual seeking search started. I suddenly became aware of that part of life, and I also started to explore childhood. So that was the first time. The expression I used at that time was the lid came off. So it was like the lid had come off, a lot of pain or emotion started coming up. But it was the first time I realised, oh, my childhood has affected me. So that was in itself obviously an important insight. But I think partly because I was going through that at a time when there wasn't a lot, in a way there was even less support at that time. I think there was less understanding of that. For whatever reason, it didn't do the full job. And I think one of the things about the dark night and the timing of it is that it seems to be incredibly intelligent. It's almost like it only happens when the circumstances are just right. They might not feel right, of course. They often feel really dreadful. But there is something about the timing of it that seems just right for each person. And that time of my life wasn't it for me. And in fact, after a couple of years, I had my son. And so I think there was something else needed to happen first, almost. What was useful from that experience was that I did have some knowledge of how it was to be in that place than when the dark night happened nearly 18 years or so later. But there was a depth and completeness in the dark night that wasn't there in the Saturn return. So it was a bit like, yeah, a bit of a practice, really. Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions?
A question about your sense of self. Because you said, or you read, you're not that concerned. Well, you read this part where I don't care if I'm going to work at a bakery or. So it seems like you're not concerned with status, society at all, or what people think of you. I wonder what it's like for you now, because I think what other people think of us and our place in society is very important for our sense of self. And I also think you cannot really, well, I believe Eckhart Tolle says you shouldn't try to define yourself, but I think, well, in engaging with other people, you cannot have you cannot not have a sense of self.
Yeah, totally.
So my question is, what is your sense of self based on right now? And are you still sometimes concerned what people think of you, or if things will
Yeah.
succeed in your place in society?
Yeah. So just to say, one of the challenges of writing a book is that, particularly with a quote like that, where I'm saying, I don't care if that's like a moment in time. I'm writing in my journal, that's coming in. So it's not that then becomes a permanent thing necessarily, but that's an insight in the moment. So I'd say my sense of self is I guess what you could call a normal sense of self, in the sense that, I define myself in all sorts of different ways. I'm by my work, by being a mother, by being a writer, all the usual ways that we do. And I would agree with you. I don't think there's any problem with self-definition. Like, I don't see an issue with that at all. I think the real change in a way is that there isn't, that there's more fluidity in that somehow. It doesn't feel quite so fixed. So I'm aware of the fact that I could wake up any given morning and just not want to do what I do anymore. And so I don't think my worth is attached to my definitions in quite the same way. So, we often have a kind of equation, don't we? I'm worth something because I'm X. And I don't think, I think some of those equations have been unravelled. So that my sense of myself isn't so dependent on the definitions. The definitions are part of it, but it's not, it doesn't have that sense of the dependency on them. So the kind of sense of me-ness is almost like more organic in a way, rather than being hooked into certain facts almost. Does that make sense?
It does. I think I would have to think about it for a while.
Yeah,
before
sure.
I can say if it
Yeah.
makes, I think like rationally it makes sense. I still, oh yeah, Mike. So, is there nothing that you kind of are attached to, that you think, I need this to not die or something, or to be a person?
I mean, my deepest attachment is to my son, obviously. So, I mean, in terms of other definitions, other things, I would say I don't think there's any other. There are lots of attachments, of course. So I love my work. I love lots of people. There's lots of people here I love. And in all the ways that we normally do. So for me, it isn't about not being attached to things at all. But what I would say is that even my attachment to, and I don't talk about this in the book, but even my attachment to my son has been really challenged because he's been through a serious disease. So he's had surgeries and so on. So even that has been tested in a way, and he's fine now. But I wouldn't say that there's any. I can't answer what would happen if I didn't have that attachment. If he wasn't around, I don't know what would happen to my sense of self, is the honest answer. I think that's, like I say, it's easy to think, well, if I wasn't doing my work, I don't see that would be a major effect on my sense of self. But again, I think it's very difficult to really speculate about how we would be in any hypothetical situation. So one of the things that I try and steer away from is to make any kind of declaration about how things are for me, because it changes, it can change moment by moment. And a lot of the time the answer is that I don't really know. I mean, all I can know is I really love what I'm doing now, but if I stop loving it next week, I don't know how that would impact on my sense of self or not. So does that make more sense? Yeah.
One last short question. Would I be able to offend you?
Yeah, yeah, totally. I mean, I think I'm probably. So, for example, I'm less offended by other people's views or beliefs, but I'm sure you could think up something to offend. I mean, I don't think you would, because you don't look like a very offensive person. But yeah, totally. I mean, I think the thing about this is that the full range of human emotions and experiences is totally possible, isn't it? Totally accessible to all of us. So I'm not sure that I believe that anybody is completely unoffendable. And I'm not even sure that that's desirable. You know, taking offence is just one of the many parts of life, isn't it? And I can think of things, I think there are probably lots of things that I find offensive. So, yeah, I think we need that. It's not like we're trying to become this sort of blank slate that has no reactions or no. I think that would be quite strange in a way, almost to zombify ourselves. You know, I think that's part of our aliveness. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks
you
a
can
lot.
try and offend me later.
No, I won't.
Are there any other questions? Anyone?
And just to say, we can take time now to, have cups of tea
Yeah,
and
we've
mingle
been
and
sitting
talk
for a long
and
time.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
maybe we can just, if nobody has a question they want to ask now, nobody's leaving. I think we still have time. Maybe we can go outside, enjoy the weather, and make this a moment to relate to each other and tell each other and ask each other and be okay with whatever we are right now. And if that changes in 1 hour, it's also okay. So I really want to thank you, Fiona, for visiting us and for being so vulnerable and telling us your story. And even though I was looking for it, not giving us the easy answers, that is, sometimes we look for them, but sometimes it's really nice when somebody tells you they're just not. So just stop looking for them. And I want to thank all of you for coming and asking your questions and listening to us. So thank you very much.
And thank you so much, Sarah. And again, thank you so much, Anna and Simon, Mariella.
Yeah.
And there's Christian Column somewhere down there. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Let's have some tea.